It's Chelsea.
It's Nina.
And you're in the Critics' Kingdom.
So, today we're going to be tackling Don't Look Under the Bed.
A childhood, genuine horror film, I would say.
Yeah, definitely one that I remember I enjoyed it, but also it definitely has, this is probably the scariest of all of the DCOM Halloween films that I've seen.
By far, I would say.
Yeah.
I was terrified of it when I was younger. Even just from the promos that they used to run.
Yeah. Oh,
I was
yeah.
like, this is not... Like, it was... This was just not something that I think I should engage with. And I think I watched it maybe once or twice. And every time sort of knew it was great and also immediately regretted it. So that was my interaction.
Yeah, I remember liking it. But yeah, also that it had a little bit... It actually had some fear factor in it. And it came out in 99.
Still the wild 90s, man.
Still the wild
Anything
90s.
goes. That's
years.
why. They were like, we can scare these kids. It's fine.
It's true. The early years, they were on their stuff when it came to Halloween. They really were.
So I guess to just, do
Go
a quick rundown.
Recap, yeah.
So we enter the film and we're sort of soaring over at night this town of Middleburg. And our protagonist, who we will come to learn is named Francis, is via voiceover sort of narrating about this town, Middleburg, that's kind of just, it's very middle America. That's what it is. It's nothing too crazy, nothing. It's not too dull. It's just a middle of everywhere situation. But we kind of already know that things are going to get a little wild because it's clearly a topsy-turvy world, as is told to us through the always tilting camera angles that this film will employ for the duration of the film. It's very sort of Nightmare on Elm Street-esque.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get into Francis's room, and we do see this little doll on her nightstand, on her chest of drawers, that sort of turns its head really creepily, which again, y'all, this movie was scary. It's still, even as I was watching it now, I was like, oh, these are things that still kind of tweak me. They kind of throw me off a little bit. But her alarm clock goes off, and she wakes up, and it's 7:23. But immediately you can kind of tell it seems dark. It seems dark for 7 o'clock in the morning. But her and her whole family come downstairs and they start making breakfast. So it's her mom and her dad, and then her 2 brothers. She's the middle child. Her older brother Bert and her younger brother Darwin. And as they're preparing for breakfast, obviously it's family around the table sort of scene. And their mom realized that there are no eggs in the fridge. She's like, I just bought eggs yesterday. Where are all the eggs? And she accuses Bert first of doing something, and Bert is like, I didn't do anything. Leave me alone. And then they also realize that it's actually not 7:23 in the morning, it's 4:23, and that somehow all the clocks in the house were set forward 3 hours. Again, Bert is accused, and Bert is like, I really did not do that. Why would I want to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning? Leave me alone.
Poor Bert.
Yeah, he really does.
He's the scapegoat for everybody, and he has nothing to do with anything.
Literally nothing to do with anything in this film for the most part. So they all go back to bed, and then next morning, and a lot of this you do get voiceover coming in from Francis, sort of explaining this thing, because she's essentially telling us about an event that happened in her town.
Right.
So she's essentially telling us the next morning she wakes up and she goes and she's walking to school with her best friend Joe, I believe is her best friend's name.
Yeah, Joe. First black best friend we meet in the DCOMs.
I do believe so. And Joe essentially tells her, isn't it crazy that all the alarm clocks were set at 4:23 this morning? And Francis is kind of like, what do you mean all the alarm clocks? She's like, yeah, everybody's clocks were set forward 3 hours, and everybody's eggs are missing, sort of in this little town. And Francis is like, wow, that's really strange. And then also sort of all of the dogs end up on the roofs, and we see sort of intercut in that we see this, a clawed hand situation, like a Pied Piper of dogs, sort of just kind of getting all these dogs onto the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly we know something is really afoot in this town and somebody's doing something. So Frances gets to school and we figure out that she has actually skipped a year ahead. Her best friend is still in 8th grade and she is starting high school because she's apparently that smart. Her parents are scientists. It all tracks. She's named after Francis Bacon. So she's a child of logic and observation and drawing conclusions based on logic and observations.
Right.
Very scientific methods sort of through and through. So she's on her way to school, and the first sort of weird things that happens is that she sees a guy on the rock, sitting on the rock, who seems to be sort of staring at her. And I think she asked Joe, like, oh, like, who's that guy staring at me on the rock? And Joe's like, I don't, nobody. There's no one there. So she's like, oh, that's weird. And when she glances back, now he's gone. So she's like, oh, that's weird. But she thinks, it's weird because she thinks maybe someone's checking her out.
Yeah.
Which is, that has its own issues embedded within it. Like, you know, stalking is not a healthy, it's not a healthy way to exist in the world, period. But, so she goes to biology class and she essentially starts doing a survey amongst her classmates to see if everybody's house actually was affected by, you know, this weird random phenomenon. And her biology teacher catches her doing that, and he sort of is upset with her about it,
he clocks it and he's like,
Yeah, and which is weird to me because I feel like if you're a biology teacher, if you're a science teacher at all, and you have a kid in your class whose version of, you know, being overeager or being disruptive is literally compiling data in a in a scientific approach to study a phenomenon that happened in real time in the space around them, wouldn't you be excited about that? That you have a student who's like interested in looking at the world through those lenses. But I digress. The point being that he sort of clocks it, and then we see that the biology teacher's car is actually a very great shot of just like essentially all of the eggs from the town descending onto this man's car from above. And again, we have that sort of, you know, clawed hand on the roof. So like this is just the first weird day of things. And you know, Joe and Fran sort of talk about it as they walk home. And Joe also mentions to Fran that she had a crush on Fran's older brother, Bert. And here's where we learn that something happened with their little brother where his life needed saving. And Bert was able to do that, which is part of the reason Joe has this crush on him. So, okay, the next morning, it sort of seems that, well, also, before I forget, she does see Larry again. Who she will learn is called Larry. She's the guy again. And he's sort of like, you can see me? And she's like, of course I can see you. You're standing right in front of me.
Right.
So the next day, you know, the pranks sort of continue. The Jello in the swimming pool at the school is turned into red Jello. Someone releases a hive of bees in the principal's office, which is like, don't ever do that, but that is so funny.
It is very funny
as a concept. And like the school bus is filled with water, and so like that happens like the next day. But then, as this situation progresses over a couple of days, the pranks seem to become more and more tailored towards Frances. So, like, there's a bunch of flowers that are laid outside of of Frances's house that say Joe loves Bert. And Joe is really upset because she's like, Frances, how could you do that to me? I told you it was a secret. And Frances is like, I didn't do that. Why would I ever do that to you? And Joe's like, you were the only one I told. You're the only one who knows. So it had to have been you. It couldn't have been anyone else. She goes to school and all of the lockers have been spray painted with bees, like the literal letter B, except for hers. And on the inside, hers has a letter B, and since she's the only one who knows her locker combination, everybody in the school now believes that like this new kid who's like weird already because she skipped a grade is like also this like master prank troublemaker.
Right.
Sees Larry again in the cafeteria and she confronts him. And she's like, dude, why are you following me? Like, you know, the whole shebang. And he tells her that, I'm an imaginary friend, like, I'm Larry, I'm an imaginary friend, it's weird that you can see me, and she's just like, stop lying to me, because obviously scientific mind, doesn't believe in imaginary friends, and he's like, no, it's true, and she ends up in a situation where she realizes that, she's like yelling at him, but it looks like she's not yelling, she's yelling just generally, like, on top of a cafeteria table, and so now, the principal and the school are involved because they're just like, what's going on with you? And they pretty much frame it where they think, she has a meeting with the principal, her biology teacher, who has, because his car was egged, he's like, it's definitely that one.
Right.
She was walking around collecting all of these accounts of the clocks being turned back. She knows what's going on. And the school therapist. And they're essentially pocketing the idea that, maybe you're not mature enough to be in high school yet. And this is too much for you. Or maybe you're responding, like, this is a latent response to, your little brother almost dying of leukemia. So that's sort of where we learned that happened. And essentially, Bert gave Darwin his bone marrow. And that was what was able to save Darwin's life. So while this meeting is happening, she sees Larry, like, outside of the door, and she's trying to tell them that there's this guy, Larry, and he says the boogeyman's after me, and he tells me he's an imaginary friend, but he's just messing with me. It's probably him. She sees him outside the door, and so she runs to go chase after him, and the principal and everybody, like, chase after her as well. She finds him in the music room smoking a bubble pipe, by the way, which is... I desperately want a bubble pipe. I need them to bring that into the market as, like, a toy option, because that would just, like, I would gladly be Larry for Halloween and run around with my bubble pipe. But he essentially starts to, like, put on this huge show where he's playing all these instruments and he's banging stuff and he's conjuring up animals and he's doing all of these, like, different sort of pretend storylines. And the principal and stuff arrive, and Francis is like, you don't see what's happening behind me? Like, you don't see this crazy person doing all this stuff? And they're essentially like, no. Something's going on here, obviously. So they call her parents, and, she gets taken home. Her parents are trying to work out. They're like, are you really not emotionally ready? Like, what's going on? And she's really just adamant about the fact that that's not what it is. She really is seeing someone. She doesn't know why everyone else can't see him. And her mom comes up with this hypnosis theory that, I don't know if you guys remember, but back in the 90s, that was a really popular thing in television.
That, like, somebody's been hypnotized.
That somebody's been hypnotized. It's this whole thing, and when she gets home, like, after she gets home, she's there for a little bit, Darwin comes to her, and he's essentially saying something to her about the boogeyman. Like, how all the kids in the park are talking about the boogeyman. She was like, what? Who told you that? And he essentially tells her that Larry is there in the park telling kids that. So she gets up and she goes to the park to confront Larry again. And he's, like, in there, like, playing basketball in, like, a karate uniform, yeah. I think.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole part where he's, like, on the monkey bars as a black man being a monkey. Like, yeah. Literally acting like a monkey. And that's, again, another... We can talk about that later. But essentially, he's telling her, like, no, this is real. I was sent here to defeat the boogeyman. I don't know why it's targeting you, but clearly, like, did you piss off a boogeyman lately? And she's like, boogeymen aren't real. And he's like, yes, they are. Let's just go to the library. I'm sure we'll figure out how to defeat the boogeyman if we go to the library. So they go, and there just happens to be a book in the library that's literally all about boogeymen and what they are and how they exist. And so Francis and Larry sort of go into that and read it. But essentially in this book, they learn, okay, boogeymen live under the bed. So, they check under Francis' bed, like, is there a boogeyman there? Obviously, like, there isn't immediately anything there. They learn that boogeymen are created, they are the extension of a child who forgets an imaginary friend too early or stops believing an imaginary friend too early creates a boogeyman, because, like, now that imaginary friend is, like ages and decays and turns into something, like, sinister and horrible.
Right.
And lives underneath that child's bed. So that's how a boogeyman works. Larry sort of asks Francis and is like, did you have an imaginary friend when you were little? And Francis is like, no, I didn't. That just was never the case. But this is also where we find out that apparently Larry was Darwin's imaginary friend. And this is where we find out that Francis is actually the one who told Darwin to stop believing in in his imaginary friend. And Larry gets very upset when he learns that. And we see his eyes sort of flash purple, and that's an indication of the fact that Larry is beginning to change into a boogeyman himself. So he's here to defeat it, but he also is aware that like this thing is happening to him, and he is not very happy about that. And there's like a part where like a bunch of purple smoke comes out from under under the bed. Don't look under the bed. And then the boogeyman is now on the roof, and that's when we get our first sort of shot of the boogeyman, and it is again horrifying,
grotesque,
scared the crap out of me when I was little. I would describe it as a naked mole rat in fancy dress with longer claws.
Yeah, Victorian naked mole rat.
That's just how I feel. So like Larry is trying to like stop the boogeyman, and the thing is Francis can't see the boogeyman on the roof. Only Larry can. So Larry's trying to like interact with it, and the boogeyman's essentially like, Larry, don't you know? You'll be me soon. You'll be taking over from me. And he's like, never! I'm never gonna do that. And he's like, you have no choice. Your child has grown up. And the boogeyman did the new prank that they did was that they put all the Christmas lights up and turned them on. So Frances is standing outside of her house when all the Christmas lights go on in the middle of the night, and her parents are they're really over it. They're like, Frances, girl, what is happening? like get it.
It's you. Sis.
Get it. It is obviously you. Get it together. So the next day, while in that book there was also a way to defeat the boogeyman. It's called the temperfuge, and essentially just like steals his soul by like aging it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this big machine, and so Larry is in the garage like trying to build that, and he says this great line where when Francis asks him like, what are you doing, or how do you even know how to do that, he goes, it's so simple a child could understand it, a grown-up couldn't understand it at all. Which is just like, that's well done writing in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But we see that as he's building it, Larry is starting to change more and more with like claws and stuff. But he has a plan, and the plan is, okay, we build the temperfuge, and what we do then is we lure the boogeyman to the temperfuge by making boogeyman's favorite snack, which is called boogie goo, a concoction that consists of rotten eggs, burnt sugar, bacon grease, jalapeno peppers, anchovies, Limburger cheese, iron, I believe. Just random, but school leftovers, slugs, and week-old sweats. So there's whole gags in this about, like Bert's gym socks and things like that. Right. And Larry starts cooking this up in the kitchen after he finishes the temperfuge. The gag is, though, apparently the school psychiatrist is coming over for dinner. So while Larry is in the kitchen concocting all of this, Frances is trying to, like, mitigate what's going on in her kitchen while sitting literally in front of the person who is meant to psychologically evaluate her, along with her parents and her brothers, the whole shebang. And it's interesting here because there's this blurring of what's real and what's not, because again, like, no one else can see Larry, but the things that Larry does affect real life.
Right.
Like there is literally a pot in there that is filled with this gross stuff. And it smells bad, and the whole shebang, and it ends up in like the therapist's smoothie.
Yeah, or like they make her some sort of pudding.
Yeah.
Which ew. For dessert at somebody else's house, but they make her like a vanilla pudding, and then she like gets a little bit of gym sock in it.
It's just horrible. Like,
yeah,
so
which is
gross.
actively horrible.
Like essentially the dinner, it doesn't break up, but the kids are sort of excused. And Darwin walks through the kitchen, and Larry's trying to get his attention. He doesn't see Larry, but Darwin accidentally steps in a little bit of the boogie goo that's on the floor. And he goes up and he sort of just hanging out in Frances's room.
Mm-hmm.
And so Frances also leaves, goes to Larry, and is sort of like arguing with him about the fact that he needs to get this together.
In Darwin's room.
Why
they were in Darwin's room.
Yeah, I think she went up to find Darwin or something of that nature.
Yeah.
And Darwin's like not there.
Right. And
they essentially figure out by following the trail of boogie goo that like Darwin went and sat on Frances's bed and got snatched up by the boogeyman that's living underneath there.
Mm-hmm.
So Larry's like, okay, we got to go get Darwin. but I'm gonna go do it because you shouldn't enter the boogie world. Let me do that. So he sets up the centrifuge, plugs it into the wall, and like takes everything and goes underneath the bed and like disappears underneath the bed. Frances looks underneath the bed and sees that there's like a wormhole vortex sort of situation. So she's kind of like resolved to sort of not go, or not. She's not resolved to not go, but she's hesitant to. And this sort of ties into, because what we do learn earlier, or what Larry accuses her earlier when she says that she told Darwin to stop believing in him. Larry accuses her of sort of doing it to, in theory, make Darwin less scared, but that she was actually the one who was scared.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Bert donated the marrow instead of her, because she wasn't able to do it. And she's like, no, I physically wasn't a match. That's the only reason why I didn't give him my own marrow. And Larry's like, all right, whatever. But so we see this moment where she sort of hesitates, but then she's like, you know what? Nah, I'm gonna go get my little brother. Like, whatever is going on, Larry is also turning into a boogeyman. Like, I'm not taking this risk. I'm going after my little brother. So she goes underneath the bed, and we enter the boogie world.
Mm-hmm.
A world of topsy-turvy decay and indigo smoke.
It's like if your bed, under your bed, was like blown up to gigantic size and you're the smallest thing under there. Very much reminded me of Shark Boy and Lava Girl.
I feel like that's a very accurate comparison. Even in the color scheme, like the fact that it's
like the same
purple and it's like red and blue. Like that's very accurate.
I was just waiting for Taylor Lautner to come out and start singing and dancing. He did not, by the way.
Oh, but in the perfect world. And everything underneath the bed is blown up. So for example, when they do find Darwin's like trapped inside of a sock. But it's big enough to be a sack that I guess one would kidnap a child in. Like back in the 40s. I don't know. Anyway. So they have the centrifuge and they're going to go find the boogeyman, defeat it. But as they're going, the centrifuge, first of all, like, they're not able to fully use it because the centrifuge cord isn't long enough. So it, like, snaps out of the wall or whatever, and, it doesn't work anymore. Also, this is the boogeyman's realm, so it controls everything, right, sort of, They're
in his home court right now.
Exactly. They're unprepared. Right. They're unprepared for all of the ups and downs of that. And then to make it worse, Larry is straight up turning. Like, Larry is essentially towards, like, by the end of it, he is pretty much entirely a boogeyman.
Yeah.
And it's kind of great because you get this shot of the two of them together, like, doing boogeyman things. And I like to think of them as the outcast of Nightmare on Elm Street. Like, that's the vibe that I get from them. Mm-hmm. They're like boogeymen speak in rhymes. So they're both sort of, like, riffing off each other. It's quite fun. But so Frances is like, wow, it's really just on me now to figure this out. And she sort of devises two plans. One is to MacGyver her way to some sort of conductor battery to allow the centrifuge to work, and to make Larry not be a boogeyman anymore.
Right. By
telling Darwin to believe in him. So she's like yelling at Darwin, believe in Larry, and he's like, you literally told me not to. And she says, I was wrong. Like, you should believe in him. He's real, the whole shebang. So Darwin starts believing Larry, and Larry changes back, and then is, like, able to help out even more with the boogeyman and all of that stuff. She does get this MacGyver situation to work, and so the centrifuge, like, it's working again, and, it looks like she's winning, but then the boogeyman just short circuits it, with his long claw.
Right.
Because, again, boogeyman's home court, like, I'm sure that it's well skilled in staying alive.
Right.
Because that's what it had to do. That's how it became a boogeyman. But then the boogeyman calls her Franny. And Fran is like, it triggers something in her, and she remembers that the only person that has ever called her Franny was Zoe, who was Fran's imaginary friend, who she forgot about. And arguably, it seems, maybe even started forgetting about or started abandoning when Darwin became sick years ago. and again in that way of like as a sort of a coping mechanism, like
Right.
it's time to stop believing in things that aren't real because my little brother, probably baby brother, I would think, maybe
Yeah.
like 2 or 3, is really sick. So she remembers Zoe, and in remembering Zoe, the boogeyman turns back into Zoe, and it's this whole moment where Larry's like, "Oh, the boogeyman is a woman,"
Right.
and Zoe's like, "Yeah, bruh, like
I
boogeyman
prefer boogie person.
yeah, like boogie people.
Yeah.
Those are the words that we use." And so now we guys they can leave the boogie world and they come back into the real world, and we also, it's important to note that Zoe is the doll that we got in that first shot, that early shot that like turned her head while Fran was sleeping before the clocks change, and we get little shots of the doll turning its head before weird things start happening around. So they come back into the world, the human world, mortal world, and Fran is like, "Hey, you guys can, be our imaginary friends again." And they're both kind of like, "Well, no, you guys don't necessarily need us anymore." And Darwin's like, "But Larry, I believe in you again." And Larry says, "If you need me, you can call on me and I'll come. But you've got your big sister and you'll be okay. And you guys got each other and you've got each other's backs." And, her and him and Zoe, they're gonna go stop another boogeyman in Newburgh, like a town over.
Right.
And so they're going off. There's a kiss with Larry and Fran that's like, I wasn't tracking no type of romantic story in this, but I guess she did think he was checking her out at the beginning and she was into that, so I suppose it
was
makes
literally
sense.
A girl, I guess. But it was
I suppose
it did come out of, I'd say, like, out of nowhere for both of us. Like, we were both like, wait.
Huh?
It's like, wait, this is okay.
Like, I really thought that y'all were just gonna be homies, but okay,
right, yeah.
fair enough.
I just thought he was gonna be like, it's been fun, time to go.
But yeah, so that is the film. That's how it breaks itself down. And I don't know, this was I feel like there's actually a lot in this to unpack.
Yeah, there's a lot of different like themes that they kind of cover in this one. More than just I think more than just what you would expect. Like, even the whole idea that they're using, that you could see all of this as like a metaphor for Fran and her like fear of change, and like the fact that her brother is in remission or cured of the leukemia, and then now she's also having to become so much more mature by literally skipping a grade and moving to high school, which is, it's like, I feel like you could argue like, oh yes, like the way that we separate things are kind of arbitrary in terms of like schooling, but it's like, it is a big socialization difference between being an 8th grader in middle school and a 9th grader in high school. So the fact that she literally went from a 7th grader to a 9th grader in, over a summer. Yeah. That's a big change for somebody, and it can scare you and can make you stressed out. And even though I think she seems the type that would revel in being an outsider, it still is like, I don't have a support system though. It's like, I don't have my sister, I don't have my friends aren't here. Bert is here, but Bert is clearly useless.
Literally, Bert is literally just living his own life. Like, he's just not. He's like, I'm what, 16?
Yeah, they never say how much older, but he's at least a year or two.
Yeah, he's I have my own friends, my own thing,
and he's clearly like a cool, popular kid. So it's like they don't, like there's no like crossover, and it's like she's just kind of having to figure it out on her own. So that can cause a lot of stress in somebody to the point where you would start like, I don't want to say hallucinating, but I could see how you could like create your own world and like make yourself the center of things. She's also the middle child, which, as we know statistically, they are in Middleburg. They're in Middleburg. She's the middle child. The middle child tends to be ignored, and especially somebody like her who performs so well, her parents are probably like, we don't have to worry about you. We got your little brother,
and they even say that to her, I think. Yeah.
Right. And we got Bert, who is clearly, out here like he's a rebel without a cause. So
literally a rebel without a cause.
So then they're probably just like, but we don't have to worry about Frances. Frances could do well by herself. Yeah. Like, she doesn't need us to always be there to support her, because she has like that internal discipline and support and self-esteem and confidence. So she's probably getting a little bit forgotten, and I'm not saying that it's a cry for attention, but that's definitely one way that you could see it.
Yeah, and that's clearly the sort of the entry point to thinking about this, because that is literally what happens in the film.
Right.
You know, that's what everyone assumes. They're like, yeah, you're clearly going through a lot right now.
Right.
So, yeah, we're not even going to suspend you from school for doing all of this, but yeah, maybe we do need to reconsider you being in this grade. Maybe we do need to slow things down for you a little bit, because you are still a kid.
Because you were stressed.
Yeah, and this is clearly if not a cry for help, it is a reaction to very heavy amounts of stress that are being put on your psyche right now, in theory. And I think that that's a general sort of trope of horror as a genre, is that we tend to use it, in many instances, we use it as a metaphor for variations of, changes in mental state or mental illness, if that's the easier way to describe it for some people. I try not to do that.
To group it all together.
Yeah.
Or to... It's a separate thing. But...
Yeah, or to say that because someone thinks a different way that they're ill.
Yeah.
Or experiences the world a different way that they're ill. Like, I don't necessarily think that that's a helpful or progressive or considerate way to look at these situations.
Right.
But just for the sake of ease, I can use that term.
For this DCOM.
Yeah.
We will use that framework.
Yeah. But yeah, just as a genre, horror films tend to lean into that space. I remember the Babadook that came out.
Yeah,
which is actually weirdly kind of similar to this.
I've never actually watched it. I only consumed it as a meme that it became.
But that was a film that was in theory all about a mental breakdown that this mother is having.
Right. And this one could very much be seen as like Frances has had enough. Like her mind has literally had enough, and it's just like, you know what?
Yeah, and you start seeing like things that aren't there. And I think even in the idea that I think that there's an interesting idea in this, the idea that like, so if the boogeyman is like, it comes out when you're sleeping, right? But then if it gets to a certain point, it can sort of come out any time. And there's a coupling there of this idea of, the subconscious and the unconscious. Like, when you're deep in your unconscious state, that's when a boogeyman can come out. And this idea that, like, that's when you're in a vulnerable state. And this idea that sort of general unhappiness, like being unhappy, being stressed to this point, makes you generally vulnerable. Like, that's when the boogeyman goes from a place of only being able to come out when you're asleep to being able to come out all of the time, just when you're around, because you're in a permanent sort of vulnerable state. And I think that's a potential very important lesson for kids to understand, that the way that they feel does affect what's going to happen around them, because it does change how they relate to the world at any given moment. So I thought that was another little piece of that sort of mental health linked to horror as a metaphor.
Right. Well, because even the physical, I mean, the boogeyman, it's like, yes, like, obviously, the older you get, you don't believe in that as a concept really anymore. But it's like the boogeyman could be just a filler for, like, anything, for depression, for, like, anxiety, or for whatever it is. Like, that is literally people's boogeyman. It's like, that is the worst fears.
For trauma, for sure.
Right.
For literal trauma, someone did something to you, or something traumatic happened to you,
or you witnessed something, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, that is literally, it's a boogeyman. It's like, it's what people are actively, like, afraid of. And then I think especially when we get to the end, like Nina was describing, it's like Fran has to face that herself. Like, nobody else can help her. It's like, this is your boogeyman, so you are the one that needs to handle it.
And she has to acknowledge that she was genuinely scared about
her
like, she has to acknowledge the fact that she was fearful for her brother's life, but she was also too scared to help him.
Right.
That, she does sort of acknowledge that she was happy she wasn't a match.
Right.
Because she couldn't have sat underneath. She couldn't have sat in that room with all the needles and, like, gone through that process. And as far as I know, bone marrow transplants and things are also very painful.
It's very invasive, yeah.
So,
very invasive.
you know, she wasn't prepared to do that. And that makes sense because in theory, like, she was,
what, 10, 9?
yeah, like that makes sense, and she was very scared about it. But she
Yeah.
had to confront the fact that that did scare her, and that she didn't have the tools to be able to help.
Right.
And that both filled her with guilt, and it also, like, made her reach out, like, in theory, try to help her brother the only way she could. But then acknowledge that maybe that wasn't actually the best way to help him.
Right.
That maybe sometimes it's not better to take away someone's hope for the sake of reality.
Right.
Because their hope can potentially, or their belief can potentially be the thing that allows them to conquer whatever the obstacle in reality is.
Right. Or could just, you know, help them in a way that you wouldn't understand, because everybody is different. But yeah, no, I feel like that's also an important point, that she just, you know, she had to acknowledge what happened and then face those fears herself, because essentially she was projecting her own fears onto Darwin.
Yeah. And recognizing that, you know, he looks up to her, and he ate that up.
Oh,
he's
yeah,
gonna
he
do,
believed it.
Yeah, he's going to do what you say because you're his big sister.
Right.
And as a big sister myself, you know, that's something that I had to learn for sure. And there are some ways in which I'm still learning it. You know, the ways in which I can influence what's happening in my siblings' life, just by the way that I respond to things that they tell, or things that are going on with them. That can be a really big influence on the way that they act and position themselves in the world, because they are actually, like, looking up to you, as the one who went through it first, or went through it before them. So
I will say one thing that I did like is that her parents never, not lessened it, but they never punished her, which is, I feel like, what would happen with a lot of kids.
Yeah.
If you start acting out like that, a lot of parents automatically punish you, or they don't try to understand. And I feel like especially her mother was always like, we're not blaming you, like, we understand. Like, she kept saying that, like, we would completely understand if you were doing this kind of shit, because you've been through a lot. Like, we all can acknowledge that. And I do feel like I appreciate that they had, like, super supportive, like, both of her parents were very supportive.
And they allowed this, they infused this idea of, like, allowing time for her to be able to talk to them.
Yeah.
Like, there's a part right before she goes under the bed into the movie where her dad shows up, and he's like, okay, listen, like, can you really tell me what's happening?
Right.
I need you to be honest with me. Just be honest with me and tell me what's happening. He's like, Dad, the boogeyman took Darwin and is under the
now
bed.
is not the time.
And he's just like, he, like, looks at her and he's like, would you rather talk to your mother about this?
Right.
I'm gonna go. All right, I'm gonna give you some time, and I'll come back.
I appreciate parents that acknowledge their shortcomings. He's just like, you know what? This isn't how I would.
All right. I'll try again tomorrow. But that's, you know, because there are definitely households where, you know, that child would either just be silenced and sort of, like, beat into submission,
right?
Or
just,
it wouldn't be a conversation.
No.
There wouldn't be any attempt to understand what's happening. It would just be, this is what you're gonna do,
right?
And you're gonna do it. And there are even houses where it's like, and you're gonna do it with a smile on your face.
Right.
Like, put everything that you're feeling aside. It doesn't matter.
Right. Because you're a child and I'm the adult.
Yeah.
And even the fact that they were trying to get her therapy. Like, I'm like, I think, like, for some household, that would never be the next step. Like,
I know in that period of time, definitely in
99.
Definitely in, like, Black households, that was a whole running thread through varying, you know, media. This idea of, like, I even remember I'm like, in rewatching Moesha, it's like Kim says it in a moment where she's like, my mama says Black people don't need therapy, they just need Jesus and Oprah.
Right.
You know, like not that, like, Frances isn't Black, but in terms of that framework of, you know, in my household that might not have been wouldn't have been where we got to.
Right.
Because it is that thing of, you know, all you need is, like, prayer and
right, and to get yourself out of it.
Yeah,
you know,
figure it out.
But not in a way that's, like, acknowledging the trauma and learning how to process it correctly. Which is what needed to happen. It's more of just, like, I don't know what you're going through and I don't really care, but you need to start acting how you used to act, and that's it. Like, you know, so I did appreciate that her parents were both very supportive and very understanding, even though their daughter was clearly going through a lot from what they were seeing. Like, it's like, if your child automatically starts pulling pranks and like doing all this kind of like wild stuff, like
acting out, like those things that we classify as acting out,
out.
they do tend to be, not always, sometimes some kids just like to watch the world burn.
Yeah.
Like, that is a real thing. But I know I like fire. I don't know why I like fire, but I do. I like flames. They're just fun to me. But a lot of times that does tend to be a symptom, or I guess symptoms a fine word to use, of something else happening underneath the surface,
right?
And something that they themselves are incapable of expressing,
right?
That they literally don't, like, they definitely don't know how to process it, but they don't even know how to express that they are in a state of turmoil, to some extent. And so they just do things, and that is why people think Fran is crying out for help, because they're like, you're probably just doing this because you're in a state of turmoil.
Inner turmoil is happening. Something else that we ended up finding out related to, like, we were talking about the kiss at the end between Larry and Francis that took us by surprise, but maybe if you guys rewatch it, you might be like, nah girl, like, you couldn't tell.
I really don't think you'll get there.
We just weren't expecting it. But anyways, about that kiss, we looked it up, and the director Kenneth Johnson said that apparently Disney was not trying to do this. They said no miscegenation. In 1999, he had to like convince them to be like, no, Francis and Larry need to kiss, and they weren't trying to do it because Larry is black and played by a black actor,
and it wasn't written that way. He wasn't. He wasn't written black.
In the script, he was not a black actor. It was a white dude.
Or assumed white.
Well, I mean, considering the hoopla over the black one, I'm guessing they weren't doing they weren't thinking of anybody else of color either. But yeah, so he had to literally like shoot a bunch of different like versions for it and like fight to literally keep this kiss in. So as much as I think it's annoying and doesn't make any sense to me,
it is important that it is there.
It is good that it is in there because he had to fight with Walt and Co. To be alive. Walt was not alive, of course. But to even be allowed to do this, which I think was a little bit surprising for us, because it was, I don't know. It's just like you would, not that 99 was obviously this bastion of progressiveness, especially looking back, but it's just one of those things where it's like, you get those subtle reminders. Like, even also, I'm rewatching Moesha, where they have a whole episode in season 1 that's about her meeting a white former classmate of hers, and there being all of this like racial stuff that happens when they go and have like a date. And it's like sometimes when you look back, you're like, this just seems very dramatic. But
also, I actually don't even think that actor is actually white. I'm pretty sure he's not, because he's in Trinkets playing the dad, and he's definitely Latinx.
He probably is like Latinx. I wouldn't be surprised, but let's say white. He's white passing.
Yeah, but
he looks like a white dude.
But I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, they used him as the white dude, but he wasn't black. He wasn't black, and
it could be a different actor, but I'm pretty sure it's the same.
Okay. But yeah, no, he's playing a white dude in that case. But it's like, I think it's very easy also to forget that like 99 was a lot closer to when Loving versus Virginia passed than we are now. So it's like, it's honestly not that.
You're not wrong.
No, it's like one of those things where I'm like, it's also easy to forget that.
Yeah.
But you would have thought that by like 1999, it wouldn't be dramatic to have like a kid's film that features like an interracial kiss at the end that barely lasts for like 10
but at
seconds.
the same time, you think about how, I don't know, did you ever watch Maniac McGee? It was a book, and it was a fantastic book, and they made, I think it was a TV movie version that they made, probably on Nickelodeon, I'm not 100% sure, but I think Kyla Pratt is in it. I think it's Kyla Pratt and, what's his, I think Alex Prince, is that his name?
I've heard this name
The
before.
one who was in, like, Max Keeble's Big Move.
Oh,
I think that those were the two actors,
yeah.
I think.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure.
Mm-hmm.
But that whole storyline is literally about, like, the little one that he played, Maniac McGee.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe his name is Matt. I don't remember. McGee is his name. He lives in a place where, like, there is a literal line. I don't know if it's railroad tracks, something like that, but there's a literal, like, line, and on one side, it's segregated. On one side of that line, it's black people, and the other side of that line is white people. And he, like, and Kyla Pratt, like, becomes his, like, little love interest. and it becomes a whole thing because Maniac McGee is traversing this line, and all the townspeople are upset.
Right.
And that movie came out, like, I don't know the specifics on the book, but I do think the book was contemporary, and that movie came out when I was still small. So it was definitely still, I think maybe it was a period of time where that conversation was entering media in a real
was entering
way.
the mainstream.
For for the first, and it is probably because it was now a time where there are a lot more children who are being born
who are biracial, multiracial.
The results of intermixing, quote unquote. There aren't really good words to use to talk about.
It's like interracial couples.
That began a little bit earlier, probably in like the 70s and 80s, in a massive way,
right?
Because of things like Loving versus Virginia,
right? Because that allowed for it. But yeah, it's just just something to note, because I think even so, like with the Moesha one, it was completely fiction. I think this one was interesting because it was like
a real
life situation that the director straight up talked about, you know, and was like on the back end, they were not trying to let us do this because they didn't want this on. Like they were hesitant or whatever you might say about it. Allegedly. Allegedly, that's what the man said. So I just think that was an important thing to note too. Yeah.
I don't know, but I sort of I don't know. I think this is a great, let's talk about belief for a second. It's interesting because I think, it's not interesting, but Halloween is such an interesting time in our culture, and American Western, if you want to say Western, but I would say specifically American culture, because while it's fun, it is a period of time where we as a culture grapple with these ideas of real versus unreal, like natural versus supernatural, belief versus reality, or belief versus science, faith versus science, and they sort of it comes to the forefront of our interaction with one another and our interaction with the rest of the world, and it's just I think in this you see that sort of come to a head a lot, and like this idea that in order to face reality and conquer fear, you have to kind of conquer belief. And I do think even the way that we frame this, that our inclination was to frame this in the conversation of mental health and psychology, I think that is a very Western response to it, because in the West we sort of removed faith, belief, we secularized it, and we put science up, the scientific method up, as like this is the way to operate in the world. This is what actually allows you to see what's going on. Everything else is sort of superstition. But there are many cultures for whom, both in the past and still today, that's just not true. Like there are cultures, like many cultures where, no, they actually believe that it's real. They believe that what the West would call the supernatural is real. There are real realms. And those realms can be traversed. They can be here. The only time that we grapple with that as a concept is the autumnal equinox. In that moment where you're like, oh, it's Hallows Eve, and
right,
the veil drops. Right. But in other cultures, that is just a part of their reality. And I think that it's just an interesting thing to consider and to talk about. And I think that I have a very sort of natural connection to Frances because I actually did something very similar when I was little. So when I was younger, the thing that always got me, like my little sister was always very scared of real world things. So she would wake up in the middle of the night screaming about, oh, I had a dream someone came into the house and like slaughtered you all and kidnapped me. And she like couldn't look at blood. Like that was the stuff that terrified her. I was always really not about supernatural, things. And not monsters. That wasn't what it was for me. It was like demons and like the devil, and sort of rooted in faith and religious experiences that I'd had. Not rooted in faith, rooted in religious experiences that I had. So when, like, I remember being 10, and in this period of time, I learned about the Antichrist as a concept and was like, nah, hard pass. Don't, like, want that to exist at all. And then also, Passion of the Christ came out. And my parents, like, bought it on DVD or on VHS, and my mom sat down with me and my sister and our babysitter to watch it, right? And my mom hadn't watched it before, so she just didn't know what she was getting to. So by the time we're halfway through this film, or not halfway through, by the time we're at the end of this film, my little sister is bawling, and she's bawling because it's like, why they beat Jesus like that? Like, Jesus is our Lord and Savior. Why they beat him like that? And I'm freaking out very sort of quietly, like with the blanket up underneath my chin, because the whole film, there's this figure, this pale figure, like cloaked in dark cloak, in like dark linen, who's like in the corner, just lurking throughout Jesus's life. And at the end, it like does like a Voldemort situation, but more scary when Jesus like dies for everybody's sins. And it's supposed to be the devil. It's supposed to be the devil being conquered by. So, but that scared the crap out of me. So we were in a position where my mom literally had to throw that VHS away. It could not be in the house. And my sister and I would not allow any lights in the house to be off for months. Like, this was like actual trauma that lasted for a very long time. And somewhere in that, I had a moment where I was sleeping, and I distinctly remember this happening. I was lying in bed, and I just said to myself, wait. And this is the literal train of thought that happened. I went, the devil is the adversary of God. He only exists to be the adversary of God. If God doesn't exist, then the devil doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And my head went, all right, bet, great. Now we're going to be an atheist, and that's just going to be, God doesn't exist. And I was able to, and then I was fine. I was able to sleep with the lights off again. I just wasn't caught up anymore, because I was just like, all right, like, it just doesn't exist. And that's like an interesting, it's just, belief is such an interesting thing, because it, in the usual rhetoric would say like, okay, now I'm a non-believer, right? But it's not that I'm a non-believer, I just believe in something else now. And who's to say that, we have, in science, we literally have a whole set, we have a word for it. This, like, when you get to a place where you're literally operating on belief now, it's just that it's called a theory. And the idea is that, like, it seems very, very likely, but it's still not provable anymore. It's still, so we have beliefs. We have the theory of gravity, like, we have the theory of the Big Bang. And it's interesting because at the end, Frances does use science to, like, in theory, win. And she starts to, but she's still not able to. Like, it still has to be this interaction with belief. And I think that, generally speaking, it's sort of gotten a bad rap in the West. But it's because the West, like, doesn't understand that they believe too. They just believe in something that's not, like, they just don't believe in it. They believe in something else.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, the farther you go down any well, it seems to be, at least with the history of humanity, you always get to a place where you're operating on faith. And whether that faith is placed in superior beings or just other beings, or, in quote unquote laws that hold up, or that break down in a certain way. Like, it's still, you're just trusting that things continue in a pattern of sameness. And even that in and of itself might be completely false. Mm-hmm. Like, that might be us tricking ourselves. That might be us creating imaginary friends as a culture for ourselves. But because adults know a little bit more than kids, we're allowed to feel like we dictate what works and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. And I think this one tackles that very, very well. Just like the idea of, like, who believes and who also tells you when to believe and when not to believe, as Fran does with her brother, which you shouldn't do. And yeah, no, I agree. I think this is a great movie that tackles belief at its, like, core. Other than that, I think there's, like, just a lot of, like, smaller details in this film that were interesting, like the fact that her dad was kind of like the stay-at-home parent, or like the one handling all the housework. Of the two, and like he was one that cooked, like he did like all of the stuff that people normally associate with the moms, and I thought that was an interesting detail that they included in here, because I believe he was a professor too, right? Or was it only the mom?
I think so, but it's a very specific type of science that he does. It's like sewer management.
Yeah.
He has his like PhD.
He was like a
in sewer
PhD in like
management.
in that, yeah, in like sewer management or something.
Or like waste management. So it's something of that nature, though.
Right, and then also that at the end, once they find out that Zoe was the boogie person, I liked that they then were like, you should put a gender binary on like a magical creature.
On a magical creature.
Because it's like, yeah, that is a little crazy. And she's like, boogie person. And I'm like, this is actually very like contemporary. Just looking back at that, because I'm like, she's right. Like, it's like, why are we automatically defaulting to boogeyman? It's like
I could give you the reason, but
well, yes,
but others have done that better.
Right. But yeah, it's like, like I'm like, boogie person, sure. It's very interesting that we try to always gender everything in our culture.
But I think it even goes back to that thing of putting in like scientific mindsets encourage you to put things in boxes.
Into boxes, right?
And and that's not to knock it. Like, I am very much a analytically minded, science loving gal. Like, but it does. You categorize. That's what you do, because categorization and having specific definitions for everything then allows you to compare better. It allows you to make observations about that more specifically.
Right.
It allows you to fine tune specific variables while having controls. So it's something that sort of, I think, once it enters the culture, it becomes a lot more prevalent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you think you would show this to your kids?
Yeah. I mean, it's weird because like, if my kids are anything like me, they're gonna be terrified. And it might be a thing where they're like, Mom, why did you do this to us?
Right.
And on the other side, it's like, I might also, because it still got me. Like, it didn't scare me, but like, there was still moments where I was like, okay, now we don't have to. We gotta see the heads turn again.
We don't have to do all that.
This is a lot.
Right.
I did request that we watch it during the day.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that I did that.
Yeah.
So would I watch, like, what are the chances that I'm gonna watch true horror movies with my kids before they hit like 13, 14?
Right.
But if my kid is like watching it, like, I think it's a good kids horror movie for them to watch. A genuinely good kids horror movie for them to watch. I just don't know how present I'll be for that. I don't know if that's something that we're gonna share together. I don't know if I want my kids suddenly believing in the boogeyman again when, like, they stopped doing that when they were 4, and now they're doing it again when they're 8, and I'm like, all right, I can't. You have to sleep in your own bed. Like, I can't do this every night. I don't know. But I think it's a good film, and I don't think that there's anything
that gives you pause.
Gives me pause about a child watching it.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think this is like a fun one, and especially I personally enjoy horror movies. So, if I do choose to have children, I hope that at least one of them would also enjoy them. And, that could be our thing. But yeah, no, I think this is like a fun one. It's also just a great starter horror film, just like get them interested in the idea.
Yeah. Yeah, it would. After a certain age, I'd put it in my Halloween.
Yeah. Once they're like 9.
Yeah, like, let them
4th, 5th grade.
Yeah,
or
let
upper
them
elementary.
Yeah, let them get a little bit of real world experience under their belt, so that it doesn't come back to haunt me.
Yeah.
But again, like, I was 10 when I was Passion of the Christ. So maybe 11? Like, you know what I mean?
This also is not nearly as scary as Passion of the Christ.
It really isn't.
No.
Like, let me just make that very clear. It's really not.
It's just
on
like
the
the fact
caliber.
that they shot it like the Blair Witch Project, and like they're just running around with like,
and the purple eyes get a little.
The purple eye, like,
get a little.
They did very
demon-y.
good. The prosthetics and the costuming was really good in this one, and the production design was really good at this one, and it feels a lot more real than I feel like a lot of other DCOM Halloween films do.
Yeah, for sure.
But that does also make it a little bit more. It ups the fear factor.
It does.
You know.
But in a good way.
Yes.
In a very good way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, with that, guys, don't look under your bed. And
see you next week.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of The Critics Kingdom. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and SoundCloud so you can stay up to date, as well as interacting and letting us know what you guys think on social media. You can find us on Twitter at Critics Kingdom and on Instagram at The Critics Kingdom. We're excited to talk to you again next week.